Good afternoon and welcome back to our latest webinar. This one on cannabis-infused products, and really excited today to have back one of the most insightful, technically knowledgeable, smartest people we have had the pleasure of working with in this space to help us really understand what is happening in this landscape of infused products, and specifically around emulsions. We have seen over the past 18 months or so this phenomenal acceleration in the growth of the infused product market, driven in part by innovation that has dramatically improved the quality of products that are being brought to market, but also by the fact that consumers are really embracing these products. At a time that we've seen the share of flower fall from over 90% a handful of years ago to less than 50% now, as infused products, edibles, beverages, etc., have gained significant traction in this market. We're entering a new phase in the evolution of the legal cannabis market, and we believe it is one that is going to be fueled not by the long legacy impact of or influence of smokable flower, but one that is going to be defined by new and novel product forms. And so that's what we're going to be exploring today. What emulsion is and how it is in transforming the cannabis product landscape. Specifically, we are very excited to be partnering again with Source Technology, who are leaders in the cannabis-infused product space. And we are joined for this conversation by Michael Fleming, who's the VP of Technical Business Development and a leading innovator in this market. What are we going to be talking about today? We'll give you a chance to get to know both Michael and I, and hopefully by now you've attended enough of our webinars that you know us both. And then we'll get into some of the themes that we heard from you that you wanted to hear. For those of you joining this webcast, we received a ton of questions over the past couple of weeks on what you wanted to understand about not just emulsions, but where emulsions fit into this product landscape, how they're made, and what to think about as you're developing these products and coming into market. And so we took all of these questions and grouped them into 5 themes. One, we're going to talk about how to understand emulsions and what they actually mean. We're going to talk about product stability, which was interesting that we got quite a number of questions around this theme of how do you ensure that the products that you're getting out to market are stable and once they're on store shelves. We're going to talk about how to get your product from the back of the napkin idea and into production and out into the market. And some really critical issues there to understand. And under that umbrella, how to navigate the regulations that are so critical to being successful in this space. And then finally, we talk about lab testing. And there's been some interesting developments in the lab space that I think raise some questions for product manufacturers as they figure out how to ensure that the products are being effectively tested, and give some guidance on how to can ensure that the results you're getting are accurate. And as always, we'll close with an outlook for this market. We'll be looking into our crystal balls to explore a little what we think are going to be some of the critical trends that will shape this market moving forward. But before we get started, if you have not already done so, please go to newfrontierdata.com/reports and access 2 reports which we've co-produced with Source that navigate and that explore in fairly substantial detail the themes that we're going to be exploring here. One, understanding the consumer landscape for these products, for infused products, what's driving their adoption, what types of consumers are looking for these products, and what are we seeing as in terms of the products that are coming to market that are setting a new standard, a new benchmark for this market. And then the second is navigating the complexities of the infused product landscape. Beyond the broad regulations that govern cannabis, which is an intensely regulated market, there are specific rules governing infused products that you do need to be aware of. And so This second report, Navigating the Complexities to Market, provides an overview of some of the key themes that you should be paying very close attention to. So go to newfrontierdata.com, as you're getting your reports, as you're thinking about what we're going to be discussing, in your audience interface, you will have a Q&A button. Submit your questions to us and we'll get back to you. So even though you're listening to this as a recorded webcast, we will take your questions through that Q&A interface in your audience panel. And we look forward to hearing what additional questions you have for us and getting back to you with our answers. So without further ado, quick introductions. My name is John Kagia. I am the Chief Knowledge Officer here at New Frontier Data. And in that capacity, I have the privilege of leading the research team that produces and publishes much of the work that we've been doing here over the past 6.5 years. You know, I find the cannabis space relentlessly interesting. As a market analyst, as a data junkie, it's been just a privilege to study the evolution of this market. And the few aspects of this market that have evolved as dramatically and as profoundly as the infused product market. It was only a handful of years ago that infused products in this space were homemade brownies being sold beside point of sales in dispensaries. And now you walk into dispensaries in California and Colorado and Washington, and the majority of the store is taken up by not flower but by these value-added products. And to think that despite all of the innovation that has happened in this space, we've barely scratched the tip of this iceberg, means this is a profoundly exciting space and one which we will see continued growth and continued innovation in the years to come. So really looking forward to this conversation. And for this conversation, we're joined by just an extraordinary expert and leading technical perspective in this market. Michael Fleming, who's the VP of Technical Business Development with Source Technology. Michael, welcome. Really excited to have you back. For the one or two people who might not know who Source is, please introduce Source and tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure, wonderful, and thanks for having us back again. Source as a company stands as a technology company where we apply technology to help people work with functional ingredients that are not immediately dispersible in standard food and beverage platforms. Most people are familiar with oil-based systems, but they don't necessarily have the oils of nature to help convert them into a dispersible platform. It can be a functional ingredient, and when we talk function, it is either a standalone therapeutic output, or it is an outcome for the finished product, the flavor, or it could be adaptogens, nootropics, cannabis products, or other things.
And given that you have such a deep background across so many markets, just give us a bit of a thumbnail about your life pre-cannabis. I think it's helpful for folks to understand the breadth of experience you're bringing.
Sure. I've been very fortunate in my career. I have worked under every one of the silos of the FDA. So my entire career has been spent in regulated industries. It could be veterinary foods and feeds, food and beverage, pharmaceuticals, implantable medical devices, all the different avenues, and worked with regulatory bodies, not only in the US, but in the EU and JP and Health Canada, and have a global perspective and understanding of, in many cases, what it takes to get some of these regulated products in front of regulators as a new product, as well as some potential pitfalls to help either end users or other customers avoid in their development and commercialization.
That's a profound perspective, particularly given that we are seeing increasing regulation in this market. And now that we've seen the introduction of the first attempt to legalize or regulate cannabis federally, it certainly seems like we're going to be seeing greater oversight of this industry in the years to come. So I think, Michael, your perspective is really, really valuable in this ecosystem. So let's get into the heart of this discussion. And as I said, we're going to be covering a lot of ground in the time that we have, but please, do add your questions to this. It not only helps us better understand what themes we should be exploring to help stakeholders in this market make better informed decisions, but it also ensures that we're getting to the heart of the issues that are most important to you. So thank you to everyone who submitted questions that are framing this. We've taken and grouped them we've grouped them thematically, but it has been really helpful to understand what you're most interested in. So let's begin just by explaining what emulsions are, because I think it's really important to have context on what this environment is. So Michael, could you just walk us through, what is emulsification and how does that differ when you're working with water-soluble ingredients versus working with oils?
Sure. Technically, an emulsion is sort of a catch-all for, it's like saying, what's a car? Well, there's a pickup truck and there's a convertible and a sports car, but an emulsion is a catch-all for a technology that helps drag one specific chemical moiety into another matrix where normally they would not have an innate capability. So the most classic example that most people are traditionally familiar with it is a salad dressing. Classic oil and water mixture. Normally they separate. You buy a salad dressing at the store, you shake it up. It holds together for a very brief moment in time and then will separate. But when you look at Hidden Valley Ranch, why does it not separate? Well, they've created an emulsion to infuse that oil into the water matrix, and it could be a water and oil matrix, it could be an oil and water matrix. But it's a mechanism for you, through the magic of chemistry and processing, to drag materials into a system where they normally would not be.
So given that there are different ways in which you can emulsify cannabinoids or CBD, is there a best way for emulsifying CBD and cannabinoids?
Certainly, from my point of view, I think that there's a best way. But I will say to most of the people that are looking for an emulsion, the best emulsion for any specific application or customer is the one that ticks off all the boxes that you can as far as your specific application and based on your specific needs and your specific requirements. Predominantly, you see a number of main types of emulsions. You can have a liposomal emulsion, you can have a micellular emulsion, you can have co-solvent approach. So those are the primary drivers that you see the predominance of things in industry, in the food and beverage space, and in the assorted industries. There are, I would say, with just like everything else in life, there are pros and cons to each one of those different systems. And it's you as the end user working with different or surveying different emulsion providers. You need to try and develop your list. What's most important to you? Is it sensory? Is it performance? Is it compatibility? Is it shelf life? Is it any of those things? All of those things. So when you're looking and surveying what's out there on the market, it's oftentimes good to have an idea of what's critical or what's most important to you, and then finding the right emulsion or the right provider for you as a customer. In many cases, some people don't understand all of the questions they should be asking or all the things that should be looking for. And that's where it's good sometimes to, watch a webcast like this, or, do some independent research or go to trade shows and talk to different people and not necessarily be sold on anything right out of the gate. You just need to find out what are all the different attributes that I could be looking for or should be looking for.
So let me pick on that thread of people don't often not know what the right questions are to ask. What are some of those questions that you find that people who are trying to build new products tend to miss and not be aware that they should be asking as they're trying to figure out how to build an infused product?
Yeah, it's a good question. And sometimes you can almost see a bifurcation of the two main buckets of questions based on, are you coming from a company or a position where you have a decent amount of predicate experience designing, in this case, a beverage? Are you familiar with using similar systems, whether they be flavored systems or other components, and you understand specific requirements by you and your company? Or are you very nascent to the space and your first time in your life creating a beverage in a beverage company? Many of those different questions and those different things that people should be looking for are different, but many of them will be centered around predominantly, when you're making something to put in your mouth, sensory is of critical importance. There is that Red Bull effect where people don't expect Red Bull to necessarily taste good because they know it just works. But the lion's share of products inside the grocery store, most of the product developers have aimed to have you have a pleasant experience consuming their product. Sensory tends to be of utmost importance. Talk about delivery systems for ingredients to which we're going to make a label claim, and the customer wants to know that they're getting the label claim. Certainly stability of the emulsified product. We don't want the cannabinoids or CBD in this case to ring out or precipitate or aggregate or any of the other classic mechanisms of failure for emulsions. And then eventually this is going to be probably regulated in some form, shape, or fashion by the FDA. So we want a high degree of safety around our product. For larger companies that have a much greater reach than, say, a startup, being able to get supply chain, being able to have enough product delivered with a sufficient amount of lead time, or having a company that can grow with you are certainly fundamental asks, maybe perhaps of a larger, more well-developed company, but yet something you may want to think about, because most people tend not to get into business to not be successful. So as your product grows and as the market grows with your product, can all of your raw material suppliers kind of grow with your growth?
We'll come back and talk quite a bit about stability, because that's clearly a theme that there's a lot of interest in. But before we get there, just a couple of final questions about emulsification. And I find this idea fascinating. Does it disrupt, there's a process of emulsifying cannabinoids into a water-based matrix, impact the entourage effect, or what is there any interplay or effect on the outcome and the experience of the cannabinoid in the way it's ingested caused by the process of emulsification? Or are you essentially getting the similar expenses you would with oil?
To some degree, the entourage, and I will use air quotes, the entourage effect, it can be adversely or amplified, affected by the emulsification process. Different processes use different chemistries. So you want to make sure that all of the other components inside the cannabis stream, which we consider to give that entourage effect, can be simultaneously emulsified by the system that you're looking at, the cannabinoids and any associated terpenes or flavonoids or any other components inside the plant. Sometimes one system is not capable of grabbing and emulsifying all those constituent components. So that's something to look at. Another thing that you'll find when it comes down to really the experience of the customer. Remember, in a traditional beverage market, the experience is just, are you satisfied? Do you find a favorable sensory platform for this beverage or soda you're drinking? You're not expecting any additional outcome, maybe perhaps some caffeine or an energy boost from the sugar, but not traditionally a therapeutic outcome. Cannabinoids, on the other hand, people are consuming for a very specific therapeutic outcome. They're looking for that consistency of experience. And consuming standard oils, delivery systems, like directly after a Thanksgiving dinner, you may not feel the effects for quite some time, so that material can get into your intestinal tract. Where using an emulsified platform does allow those components to sort of wet out and disperse evenly inside the stomach contents. So there is a more repeatable experience. You don't want to enjoy a CBD beverage in the morning and get that right away, but then after dinner have another CBD experience and have to wait 2 hours. Mm-hmm. And sometimes these delivery systems that we're talking about today enhance the ability of those cannabinoids to get absorbed and start working as quickly as possible. No one wants to take an Advil and wait 3 hours for their headache to go away. So the same thing is persisting when we talk about cannabinoid delivery systems. We want to deliver that cannabinoid to the body in the most efficacious and the quickest that we can. For, this is a therapeutic relief, a therapeutic outcome. We want to get the medicine to the patient as fast as we can.
Well, and I think that's such an important point. We hear from quite a lot of innovators who have ideas for products based on, the flower or the raw oil, and perhaps not considering that the process of creating an infused beverage out of it may actually change that experience. So I think it really underscores, one, understanding the science by which your products are being developed, but also testing, so that you're having the idea that you had envisioned actually rendered in the product that's being developed. So product stability, we had a ton of questions on this, and I think we've grouped them here quite effectively. But maybe let's just start big picture. Is infusing beverages different than infusing solid edibles in terms of shelf stability?
In terms of shelf stability, there are some differences. When we think of degradation profiles, let's just use like classic examples. If you were going to put cannabinoids in chocolate milk, we know inherently that chocolate milk has a very, very short shelf life. Not necessarily driven by the presence of cannabinoids, but more by the presence of the matrix that you're putting it in. When we talk about differences between beverages and edible products, the biggest driver that most people need to be aware of is that matrix effect. If you put something in a product that tends to be slowly digested, like a very like a high bloom gelatin gummy bear, it's going to take your body some period of time to break down the matrix of the gummy bear to release the components that are inside. Whereas when you drink a beverage, those components are immediately available for absorption. So in terms of infusing them really is not horribly different. There are some things like when you make beverages, you tend not to have super elevated cook times and hold times, so you don't have to worry about thermal degradation. On the other hand, when you make products that are like gummy bears, we're not worried about a tremendous amount of like dissolved oxygen, or those products tend to go in foil bags, so we're not worried about UV or light strike. So infusing them tends to not be the biggest hurdle. What most people get caught up is there are differences, whether it's a brownie or a cookie or a gummy bear or a drink. The biggest change to the customer experience is literally in the matrix effects of the finished consumer product, not necessarily on the emulsion or the infusion process.
So then maybe picking on that, now, if there's not that much of a difference between the solids and the liquid infusions, how do you assess emulsion stability? What is if somebody is trying to develop a product, how do you test whether or not your product is going to have good stability? Is it really just looking at the matrix you're putting it in, much more so than concern about the effect of the addition of the oils to that matrix?
Yeah, classically, when you look at emulsions in beverages, there are certain failure mechanisms, whether it's creaming or sedimentation, aggregation, Oswald ripening, or other factors, because the matrix effects of that beverage allow those molecules to move around fairly randomly. Like they're basically free to move around in that can, in that bottle, in that final pack out. And it's also very easy, much easier to make a homogeneous product when you add an emulsion or a flavor or a colorant to a big batch tank. You swirl it around. Mixing it is relatively easy. Making sure that you have a homogeneous system is relatively easy. As you start to walk away and get into, like, we'll just pick on gummy bears, like, you have a very high viscosity system. So much more challenging to mix components into a high viscosity system to get that uniform, consistent experience. So again, it's like there are different mechanism points. When I say emulsion stability in a gummy bear, I'm traditionally more concerned about proper mixing and homogeneous manufacturing of the product. When we look at emulsion stability in beverages, I'm more worried about the failure mechanisms of an emulsion, because in a gummy, those emulsified droplets are not free to move. You may disrupt the structure of the emulsion, you may break the emulsion during the manufacturing process. But if you succeed in maintaining a proper micellular or liposomal structure during the manufacturing of a gummy, it's very unlikely that anything deleterious is going to happen as it sits on the shelf. The same can't be said for beverages. There's just much too much entropy in the system. Temperature variations and sloshing around during distribution all create these kinetic environments that allow things to go where you don't necessarily want them to go.
So if you're making a beverage, make sure you shake your cans around like crazy before you send them out to the wild. Interesting. So then, if you answer this next question around, what is the shelf life of a THC CBD beverage? Maybe I'll ask the question a little bit differently, which is, what is the range of shelf lives that you're seeing with beverages? Kind of what do you tend to see on the shorter end of beverages that say have a matrix that is prone to degradation versus what is the outbound of shelf life that you're seeing for really, really shelf stable products? Sure.
I think, again, not to overcomplicate matters, but it does sort of matter what the matrix is. Is this a carbonated product? Is this a non-carbonated product? Or is this flavor? What's the flavoring? What's the carrier for the flavor system? How much is in there? Are there other things that we need to worry about in there? Because each one of the additives that we put inside a finished food product creates an opportunity for something to go wrong or to have some interaction. It is classic. If you're just making, say, soda and you want a flavored soda, Katie bar the door, you can usually use any orange flavor that you want that gives you the desired outcome. Now, when we start talking about other matrices effects in there, does it matter if it's an ethanol flavor or a propylene glycol carrier for the flavor? Well, potentially, depends on how much you use. So I would say best case scenario where you just have maybe a still water with CBD, opaque packaging, 12 months to 18 months. If you go into an exceptionally adversarial situation where you have really low pH, tons of carbonation, whole bunch of other stuff in there, maybe 6 months, maybe 9 months. It really depends on the finished system, but that's something that when you look for providers of technology, you want to be able to have them assist in you, the finished product manufacturer, being able to determine shelf life. So people that have done this for a while can probably take a decent educated guess based on the goal of the manufacturer to predict where they think the shelf life might end up, and then you can do some testing to verify that. But it is a bit of a turn for most finished product manufacturers, and in the soda world, they're traditionally just looking for when does the flavor of that beverage sort of start to go away, stale out. And beer's the same way. When does beer oxidize and scalp? And so when we look for things, you may find that the sensory attributes of your finished product change more rapidly than necessarily the cannabinoids in there. So you may benefit from the fact that the beverage minus cannabinoids is only good for 9 to 12 months. And then if the cannabinoids are fine for 12 plus months, then the driver is in fact your beverage, not the cannabinoids. But that's something that you need to kind of figure out as a product developer.
You've mentioned carbonation a couple of times, and I just want to pull that thread just a little bit. Is carbonation one of the more influential determinants of shelf life, generally speaking, in beverages, or is it an added layer of complexity specifically when you're dealing with cannabinoids?
Yeah, it just add a slight layer of complexity, but from the attribute that when most people on the bench are designing their beverages, they will design to a final pH. Most or many people don't take into account that when you infuse CO2, you get carbonic acid inside the beverage itself. And are you at this tipping point where if you had created your beverage and it was fine, but now this slight increase or decrease in pH from the carbonic acid might push you over the tipping point. It also it's just another component and another variable and factor that do a full-fledged DOE on your beverage design and which attributes could or could not be causing instability. It's certainly worth, the CO2 adds a factor that a still beverage simply doesn't have.
Fair enough. And then maybe coming to the question of shelf life or stability from a slightly different angle. I'm curious, are you seeing interest in creating, say, infused fresh fruit juices, things that have really short shelf lives, or is the market not quite there yet?
Source hasn't seen any like fresh squeezed like RTD beverages. That we have seen the market for like smoothie bars. People will want a fresh beverage, and they simply will add cannabinoid delivery system at the site of manufacturer at the juice store. Tends to be the predominance of what I would call the freshest of fresh consumables. We do see people that are using like fresh pressed juice and natural juices, but they will have, whether it's a tunnel or a retort, they'll have some mechanism to affect the kill steps so that they can get shelf stability over time.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So what is scalping? We've heard a lot about, and we've heard them talked a lot about this, but for those who are new to the space, give us a bit of a thumbnail about what is scalping, and then perhaps how you can mitigate that from happening in your products.
Sure. I think the first industry as a whole that really embraced and tried to tackle scalping was the brewing industry. Many of the compounds that produce that over hop, like very juicy, hoppy beer styles, you're infusing the beer with a lot of loose terpenes. And they noticed over time that the freshness of the beer was starting to go away, and they were noticing a sort of declination in the total hoppy aroma of their products. Well, it turns out that all of the aluminum cans have a can lining inside them. And that's so at low pH, which most beverages tend to be on the lower side of the pH, they would attack the aluminum and literally eat their way out of the can. So most of the largest can manufacturers will apply a liner to the inside of that can to protect the aluminum from the contents, and vice versa. When people as a whole started shifting away from BPA, so the reason that BPA was used so predominantly in the industry, it is one of the single most efficient cross-linking agents that we know of. And obviously it has some health and wellness concerns. So as people started removing bisphenol A from the chemistry of the can liners, you don't get as efficient of a cross-linking. So there are active sites left over on the can liner. Well, guess what loves to go attached to those active sites is terpenes. And if you look closely at the chemical structure of terpenes, you'll find that there are a lot of similarity with cannabinoids. So what that means is whether it's the limonene or the myrcene in the cannabis plant or the cannabinoids themselves, these components have an affinity for the liner. So what does that all mean? So let's assume that you have infused a beverage with 20 milligrams and you allowed it to sit for a period of time, and you come back and you do an assay on it, and you're like, I'm only seeing 14 milligrams of cannabinoids in my product. Well, that's a can. Like, it didn't get up and leave, right? It didn't evaporate. Like, so where are the cannabinoids? And where, if you then pour the compounds out and then pour a solvent in the can, say like ethanol, to which the cannabinoids are preferentially soluble, and then you run analysis on the ethanol, you will find almost all the rest of the cannabinoids. And that means over time, and at a period of time, some of those terpenes and some of those cannabinoids literally attach themselves to the lining of a can. Doesn't mean they go anywhere. It just means they're there. It just means when the consumer gets them, they're not going to ingest them. And that is the mechanism. The good news is for many people, glass bottles don't scalp because there's no can liner, and the cannabinoids don't have an affinity for glass. Nor do we see the problem in traditional like PET beverages or containers. So it literally is a very specific condition related to packaging cannabinoid beverages in aluminum cans.
Is there something you can do to the formulation to, if you use cans as your containment method, to reduce the likelihood of scalping, or is it just a risk that comes with
it's essentially an inherent risk to packaging in cans. Source has one client that has the same cans, same liners. The only difference between, just say, product X and product Y is the type and the amount of flavor. Because remember, most flavors and carriers of flavors are going to scalp potentially. So that customer has different rates of scalping. Everything else is the same except for the flavor package. And so what that means is that you're going to have to, if you're going to go in cans, you're going to have to start doing scalping analysis based on every formulation and every flavor package on every product SKU. Classically, the easiest way to avoid the problem is to understand what your scalping curve looks like for a specific product. And then there are some manufacturing ways to alleviate the problem. They tend not to be very viable on a large scale. Most people are traditionally like over adding. So if you know that scalping diminishes your assay value by 1.5 milligrams of cannabinoid, put 20.5 in, and then you have a label claim at 20. That also gives you the benefit of having a little bit of variance for testing, worrying that way you don't have to worry about scalping. And as cannabinoids will sometimes isomerize into other components, it makes sure that the consumer does get that 20 milligrams of cannabinoids that we as a product manufacturer have told them are in the can.
So maybe just one final question about scalping. Are there some cannabinoids that are more likely to scalp than others? Or does it tend to be pretty consistent across all of the cannabinoids?
It does tend to, it looks like it's trending to be fairly consistent amongst the cannabinoids. The only thing that we don't know to date is that the cannabinoids will isomerize into, like CBD may become CBV or CBG or CBN or some of the cannabinoids just through natural. The cannabinoids tend not to be the most chemically stable compounds on the planet and will isomerize into different variations of cannabinoids. The challenge with that is that most analytical assays, they go looking for CBD because that's the major component of interest. Your limited detection and your limit of quantification may actually not be sufficient for you to find, let's say that half of 1% of CBD isomerizes into 10 different components. You may not be able to find the increase in CBG and CBN because it's still significantly small that the assay can't find it. You know, your reduction in CBD, you may actually be seeing a increase in other cannabinoids, but you just can't track it and find it without doing multiple assays at different sensitivities. So think of the industry as a whole, there's still a tremendous amount of work that can be done to look at some of these byproducts of instability of the cannabinoids.
Fair enough. So as a product manufacturer is trying to assess their stability, what kind of data should you be requesting? How do you get data on the shelf stability of your product?
I mean, classically, people will look at a couple different things. Obviously, the first foray in the field is simply on cannabinoid assay. You know, theoretically, if you have a time zero control and it's packaged in PET or glass, you're not worried about scalping. So you can assay that control over time and then correlate that data set to your specific pack out. And there are some mechanisms where you can look at stability of the emulsion inside your beverage. There's a device called a TurboScan where it will actually see most of the defects of a failing emulsion much sooner than can be seen with the naked eye. So if particles are improperly weighted and balanced, and if they start to cream and wring out, the TurboScan will see that much before you and I will with the naked eye. If it starts to sediment, the TurboScan will see that. So traditionally, you're looking at the stability of the emulsion inside the finished product in correlation with the assay value of the cannabinoid amount you originally put in your product.
So, my takeaway from that is if you're building a product, there's no excuse for not knowing how shelf stable your product is. There's the solutions that can get you insight into how long your product should be on the shelf. Sure.
And there's always, you can do real-time stability tests. So you want 12 months of stability, you got to wait 12 months. Most people will do accelerated studies. There's always a good thing to look at shipping stability. If your product going to sit in the back of a semi-trailer in Arizona in July for 7 days, where's it going? How long do you intend it to last? All of those factors will help you create a robust stability protocol.
Yeah, that's great. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the process, some of the themes to explore as you're preparing to go to market. And I thought this first question was interesting. We hear from a lot of innovators who'll be like, I'm sitting around my kitchen table, I have an idea for what is going to be the next market moving product in this growing cannabinoid economy. At what phase do you test a product? Do you go through this market research process before launch? What sort of guidance would you give somebody who's trying to think or thinking about trying to get the product from conceptualization through to rollout?
Yeah, I think as a product developer, I think this is one of the biggest mistakes that some people make. They become in love with their product because it tastes just like they want it to taste, and it appeals to their palate or their ideal vision. That may not necessarily correlate with the palate of the general consumer base, and that creating a universally appealing product is essentially very challenging. I've seen people that, one or two people at a company develop a product, they love it, they go to make it, they put it on the shelves. Maybe some people will buy it once, don't care for it, never buy it again. And so you have initial sales and then you have no reoccurring sales. Zero reoccurring sales in the cannabis market means one of two things. They didn't like the taste, or it didn't give them the result that they were looking for. Back to which one is it? There are a number of, once you get to a certain point in your development phase, like friends and family are not the right audience to put this in front of. Like there are companies, if you have the wherewithal, there are companies that can set up like a sampling booth at a mall or a grocery store and sort of do this test marketing for you to get consumer feedback. And if you have really bad scores, it tells you something. There are some people who literally were like, we're going to skip that piece. We're going to manufacture it. We're going to throw it into the market and we're going to see how it does. If it doesn't do well, then we're going to bring it back. We'll refine it. We'll optimize it and we'll throw it out there again. But that has the chance of alienating people that like, I didn't like the product the first time when it said new and improved on it. I'm still not likely to buy it, even if it says new and improved. I think sometimes people get much too close to the product and need to take that step back and get real-time data from real people. Like, what do you think of it? Do you like it? Would you buy it again? And there are a lot of mechanisms with that, but certainly much before you commit to buying a tremendous amount of cans and labels and processing time. You'd hate for people sometimes don't have a lot of extra funding to do these activities. So make sure that you're putting your best foot forward when you do finally do your first manufacturing run. And that usually is coupled with quite a bit of market research.
We say that nobody likes to have their baby called ugly, but sometimes that's the best feedback you can get.
Exactly.
A lot of time and money if you heed that feedback rather than get defensive about it.
Yep.
So what are the processes for testing or assessing the milligrams contained in a product, whether it's a CBD, THC, or the cannabinoids? Are there pretty standard ways of assessing the cannabinoid content in a beverage or in an infused product?
Yeah, I think the answer, unfortunately, is both yes and no. So there are methodologies and analytical assays that you can use to determine the milligrams that you've intended to put in the beverage, and then did you put them in there and are you getting them back out? The challenge is when we if you look up a standardized test method for, say, caffeine, every lab in the country will follow the same protocols, will follow the same assays. Will they always get the same number? No. but they're always doing relatively the same tests. So you can feel confident that a lab in Michigan and California will get relatively the same numbers. Unfortunately, there is no official standardized mechanism or assay for determining cannabinoid dosing. So that creates an environment where you could send exactly the same product to multiple labs and get widely varying results. And then you don't know who to trust. So working with, talk to other people that are in this space, find out who they might be using, what their feedback from that particular lab is, have they been happy with their customer service, and have their results sort of correlated with either their own testing or other independent testing that's been going on for much of the cannabis space. This testing is one of the key drivers for the wild west of the cannabis industry. It is wildly varied, and one thing that most people need to keep like sort of front of mind is, not all cases, but in many cases, most of these assays were generated by labs in the states that first went medical and then recreational for THC. If I was a THC grower and I wanted the biggest return for my efforts, I would want the flower that had the highest THC concentration. So many growers would take the same lot of product, the same batch, and take it to 10 different labs, and whichever lab gave them the highest result, that's the result that they use, because that was the most economically beneficial for them. So just by sort of accident or by default, and certainly not saying anyone is doing anything dishonest, many cannabis testing labs tend to be high side biased. And that's a direct result of coming out of the THC space. The challenge is that when you're talking about flower, it's very, very concentrated in THC and very low in CBD. And they necessarily weren't super, they sort of weren't invested in worrying about the CBD values. So 100 milligram dosing, a high dose for a THC market. Now, as the CBD world is coming in and we're talking about 20 milligrams. So you're talking about a fifth of the concentration. Many of those assays weren't adjusted for sensitivity for lower value ranges. So even people in the THC space that are making low dose edibles, whether it's like a 2 milligram mint or a 2.5 milligram beverage, have had significant challenges having accurate testing at that low a dose, just because the methodology was high side biased. And many of the analytical labs think that their method is sort of that's their trade secret. So they don't divulge a lot of times the methods, are we doing this? Are we doing that? So you never know exactly what they're doing. They tend to be high side biased, but it literally becomes a matter of sort of job shopping your product around to a different number of different labs, figuring out which one gives you the best sense, which one you feel most confident in, who's had the best experience, who uses what. And in certain companies, when you go to sell product into their stores or their chain, they may actually specify that you run it through a specific lab.
Yes, at least on the THC side, the lab shopping aspect of the market has both been hugely disruptive, and there's a lot of effort now to get it under control. There's a professor out of Washington State, Dr. James McRae, who's done some pretty compelling research looking at this idea of the high side bias, as you called it, on testing, and it is absolutely a thing. The companies that were testing high tended to grow their share of the lab testing market relative to those who tend to be much more normal in the distribution of testing results. certainly an issue that the industry does need to address, particularly given that we're seeing so many more cannabinoids being tested for in the market. And broadly speaking, it is also a service to customers if the results aren't quite what they seem to be on the label. So we're seeing a lot more acronyms coming into this regulated market: GRAS, GMP, GACP, etc. What do these terms mean, and why is it important that as you're looking down your supply chain, that you understand which practices your suppliers are using and whether they're in compliance with them?
Sure. Most of the acronyms you're going to see in the space are directly tied to some regulatory component or some facet of manufacturing compliance. If you're coming from a company that's already producing food and beverage products, we'll throw one out there. Like, let's say and just because it's not happening anytime soon, if you're Coca-Cola and you're making a THC beverage, the regulatory people, the product developers at Coca-Cola, they understand all of these acronyms and what they mean for their manufacturing and their safety and compliance with all of the food and beverage standards.
Mm-hmm.
Not familiar with them, now you have a great homework assignment, right? The easiest one is on the GRAS list. They're generally recognized as safe. These are components that have when the FDA was created, these components have had a huge predominance of use already in the food and beverage space, and we didn't know of anybody that overtly died from taking them, so we thought they were fine. Those are components. The one piece about the cannabinoid space that everyone needs to understand is that currently the FDA, the Farm Bill legalized the growing and the extraction and the interstate commerce, and it didn't allow you to put it in food beverage. So that's the challenge. And still to this day, the FDA has not weighed in on, is it allowed in food and beverage? Is it GRAS listed? What's the dosage? What's the type, isolate or broad? There's so many unknowns that the FDA is tackling with that it might be some time yet before they actually get their heads together and come up with what the rest of the food and beverage industry is looking for, which is guidance and standards. Many of the other acronyms center around the manufacturing process and the standards to which you manufacture the product. The ISO has fallen out of favor in some instances. CGMP, you have SQF, you've got Global Gap, you've got all of these different guidances and standards of manufacturing. They may be related to documentation. They may be centered around cleanliness and personnel and safety of your employees and auditing your suppliers and doing testing of your finished goods. If you're unfamiliar with many of these acronyms, it would be really great spend some time on the FDA website, spend some time in some regulatory bodies, get a consultant, or at worst case, ask somebody out for dinner who works in a manufacturing environment or a co-man and pick their brain for a while. And if you're not understanding these things, then go find a co-man that has experience doing this, because as the FDA eventually, hopefully, will pick up cannabinoids and approve them for food and beverage use, then other standards and compliances will have to follow suit. Like, you may have to produce it in a CGMP environment or under SQF. But the first step is getting the material, the cannabinoids by themselves, approved for an ingredient use, and then it's under which the auspices which you manufacture that food and beverage are all important regulatory things for people to consider.
I think that's such a critically important point. We saw this in the evolution of even legal cannabis markets in places like California, where it was clear what direction the regulations were likely going to go in terms of the standards in which operators were supposed to meet. And so, as a business operator in this environment, the regulatory compliance, even if it is not in effect now, that you can build into your system early, makes it that much easier to slipstream into the new regulatory environment when these regulations that we inevitably are expecting to happen get affected. If you go beyond compliant now, it really can save you a lot of headache and heartache when the rules do finally come into place.
Sure.
So a variant on that question is, we're still, given that the feds have not ruled yet on CBD infused products, there's tons of different state laws around THC product regulations. How should infused product manufacturers be thinking about this idea of a multi-state strategy?
That's a good one. A lot of times, if the product manufacturer looks to making a product that meets the most rigorous standards of compliance, and in many cases that might be the FDA, you will find that either the state regulations in many times will mirror regulations that are sort of built onto FDA. As certain states are looking at regulations now, we may see that the FDA may start to mirror some of the state regulations. Being okay in Michigan and being okay in Texas right now might be very different. But if I was going to hedge the bet as a manufacturer, I would aim to be compliant with where I think the FDA is going to go, and where I think the FDA is going to go that should be fairly simple from the rest. Go look at any food and beverage manufacturer that has a product currently sitting on the shelves of your local grocery store. That's the level of compliance you want to get to. The missing piece for us is all going to be about what is the FDA going to say in terms of safety, stability of the cannabinoids, the sourcing of the cannabinoids. That remains a wild card, but you kind of can sort of intuit where you think where they're looking at going. The easiest example is when you look at caffeine. I think a number of people at the FDA had said that if caffeine hadn't existed in the marketplace and someone proposed it as a food additive right now, they would likely treat that as a drug. So the FDA is not super fond of caffeine. If you go look up the regulations and the monographs and the testing that goes around caffeine, that's one of or taurine, or some of the things that have taken a black eye in the environment where, people have cardiac arrest by consuming X amount of, energy drinks. Those compounds are front and center of the FDA's attention. If you go looking around the regulations and monographs and the testing that are centered around those compounds, that might help you as a company intuit what the FDA is likely going to do moving forward with cannabinoids. Now, it's also a mixed bag because caffeine is a singular compound. It's caffeine, it's the chemical structure. When now we look at hemp extracts, if it's a broad spectrum hemp extract, we're looking at what equates to be the contents of a garbage truck. You've got terpenes, flavonoids, and all the different cannabinoids. And unfortunately, the contents of a garbage truck after the 4th of July are different than the contents of the garbage truck after Christmas. So how do you create a monograph that says a broad spectrum CBD extract is this, and it must contain these at these specific ratios? It is sort of a Herculean task in front of the FDA, and this is why it's unfortunately taking so long. But yes, mirror many compounds and products as you can see in the market today. That's your best chance of being close to where you're going to need to be moving forward.
So I love the garbage truck between 4th of July and Christmas analogy, and I'll just kind of pick on that to riff off this next question around, to your point, hemp is a plant, And so you have all of not just the biological diversity that happens between generations, between two plants, even if they're quote unquote meant to be of identical genetics, but then you're also seeing greater fragmentation of the hemp the hemp lines that are being grown. So how should somebody who's trying to think about building a CBD or cannabinoids infused product think about the fact that your input materials are going to vary because you're dealing with biomass, you're dealing with agriculture, and all of the variability that introduces?
Sure. Yeah, it's certainly a really intriguing quandary for many folks. And just to answer the question, to step back to like coffee, when you look at coffee or caffeinated beverages, they're standardized on the amount of caffeine. What it tastes like. It could be a dark roast, it could be a light roast. You're not worried about the flavonoids and the terpenes associated, the oils that come out of the coffee beans. You're just standardizing coffee on the caffeine. Now, what do you do in the case of cannabis? Like, do you standardize on CBD content and then nothing else matters? Well, the industry as a whole is purporting that all of the different isomers of cannabis have different therapeutic properties. CBG does this, CBN does that. So now it becomes amazingly hard to standardize on one particular compound inside the plant. Now you couple that with, we know that the plant produces these chemistries based on all the traditional agro-environmental conditions, the amount of sunlight, the amount of moisture, the amount of, the fertilizer, the soil contents. Every plant or every crop is different. And then to add to that complexity, the left right quadrant or the right upper quadrant of a field versus the left lower quadrant of a field, getting different exposure to sunlight, so they may have different soil conditions, they're going to be inherently different, even within the same crop. And many of the commercial extractors right now simply don't have the capacity to take up, say, 5 acres all at once. So you can't homogenize or standardize that even one crop. You're looking at subsections and subsets within the crop. And it becomes amazingly challenging when you want to create a standard homogeneous product. You can probably standardize on cannabinoid content to some degree. Maybe CBD, you can standardize on that, but your minors are going to be different in every batch, but the flavors are also going to be different in batches. So when you look for a delivery system, you're trying to find a system that does the very best job it can to mitigating sensory variation. And so you're not going to be able to necessarily control for the limonene, mersaline, humulene, baricaryophyllene content inside your specific batch. But if you have a system that can mute them to the highest degree possible, that's where you're going to create a standard product. It's not, you have to know that you're going to have variation. It's which product mitigates that variation the best it can.
Fascinating. And I'm sure this is an issue that will only be compounded as we see more new lines of CBD and THC genetics introduced into the market. And so a really critical kind of aspect to think about is as infused product manufacturers are thinking about where they're going to be sourcing their inputs from. So I'll just pause here for a minute because I want to remind our viewers that clearly there's no question that we are throwing at Michael that he's not able to answer in a profoundly insightful way. So if you have questions that we haven't yet gotten to, go to your Q&A button in your audience interface, type in your questions there, send them to us, we will get them, and we will get back to you with more extraordinary insights on this aspect of the infused product market. So we've talked quite a bit about regulations, but there are a few questions that I did want to just quickly touch on. One is just broad strokes. For the folks who are new to this market, What are some of the big regulatory barriers that you should have top of mind?
The first and foremost is simply the FDA. I mean, we all know there are tons of products in the marketplace. If we just stick with the beverage category, we know most consumers have seen, tasted, tried a number of different beverage platforms containing cannabinoids on the market. Technically, they're illegal under the auspices of the FDA. They are not approved for food and beverage use. Now, that hasn't stopped anyone. And the FDA has, not that they have taken or turned a blind eye. I think they're still being very diligent in their observation of the market as a whole. They have taken action for people that are making structure function claims, like saying, drink my CBD beverage, it'll cure your arthritis. Avoid structure function claims at all possible. So there's the regulatory, is it legal or not? And then am I making claims that I can or cannot? The one thing that beverage or food and beverage manufacturers need to pay very close attention to, specifically around social media. And that's often not somewhere where people are worried about running afoul of regulatory bodies. Now, let's say, for instance, you manufacture a CBD beverage, and you have this great social media page, great social marketing, and someone writes in on your Instagram page and says, hey, I love your product. I feel so much more relaxed and my knee feels better. And that's not a claim. But if you are a member of that company in the marketing department or social relations department, and you like that comment, liking that comment is affirming a statement where you're talking about a therapeutic outcome, that becomes a structure function claim. Go somewhere on social media, because what's to stop your own employees from typing in like, oh, it cured my epilepsy or like whatever, and then you just like it. There's no ability for the FDA to police those activities, so it's already a bad actor. And that's the one thing that people really have to pay close attention to, is that confirming or denying like any therapeutic outcome on a social media page is essentially a structure function claim. And that is the thing that this industry as a whole needs to stay far, far away from.
Fascinating. So some important lessons there, cautionary tales for the marketers in this industry. Make sure they spend some real time with lawyers who understand the industry's governing regulations. I thought this question was interesting here from a firm that says, they're having good conversations with big box retailers. They'll get quite far along, and then legal will intervene and say, absolutely not, we're not going to carry this product. And their question was, can I get around this issue? I'm hearing from you that just barring guidance from the FDA, that there's going to be a lot of large companies that are very loath to do this. What advice would you offer a company that is facing this conundrum of, the brand buyers being excited, but the lawyers interfering with their ability to make the sale?
Yeah, and unfortunately, the canned answer is go find another big box store. It's just not something that companies have yet been able to penetrate. You got to remember, their job as a lawyer is to reduce liability and litigious activities. And as you as a beverage manufacturer have put a can of something that is federally illegal in front of them. So yes, the buyers all want it, the stores all want it, like everyone wants it except for the lawyers and the legal departments, and in some instances the regulatory departments, simply because it's just not federally legal. Now, that being said, there are some states that are pursuing legislation, much like they did for recreational and medical marijuana. Some states have become fed up with the FDA's pace, and they are in talks about creating their own legislation if that comes to pass, you might have an opportunity in certain states to get selective products in some of the larger retailers. There are some national chains that are currently selling CBD products, infused products. So I would advise you to go play around and see who's selling what, where. There are some fairly substantial markets, like California. There are a lot of CBD infused products being sold in California. So maybe not necessarily target national distribution or rollout through a huge big box chain, but can you find a regional or semi-regional or even certain segment within certain states? The other workaround is that we all know that like oil tinctures and lotions and creams to some extent are widely distributed at airports, big national chains. And the question I always get is like, well, how come they can sell a tincture at the airport, but I can't sell my CBD beverage? And it's the form factor. Though many of those products fall under the auspices of the FDA as a supplement, and the supplement market has much less restrictive rules and laws around it. So you could sell, if you had a short format, small format, point of sale type of product, many big box stores are starting to warm up to the concept of having a supplement style product. There's some that have yet not embraced it, and some that have decided that it doesn't even matter as a supplement. They're still not carrying it. So unfortunately, it's just a matter of like finding the right audience. We all know how this market works. Like most people tend not to want to be first, but none of them want to be third. And so as people are starting to take on products, I think we'll start to see this loosen a little bit in some regards with some stores. But yeah, I mean, really, unfortunately, if you're getting pushback at the big box stores, go find another store. It for many companies has not been worthwhile, like trying to fight that battle for months and months and months and still gotten nowhere. And some of these are fairly sophisticated companies, very well connected, super great regulatory, health and safety, and still are not getting any traction. So, it's a tough road to hoe for folks.
It is going to change. We've seen quite a number of stores come around, including the grocery store that's around the corner from my apartment in Washington, which has gone from having one very small shelf of CBD infused products or CBD products to now they've got a wall dedicated to it. But it's certainly not happening at the same pace and throughout the retail ecosystem. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about nanotechnology, because I found your perspective on this issue really fascinating. And talk a little bit about the risks of advertising your product as being infused using nanotech, and why that introduces an additional layer of hazard from the regulatory perspective.
When it comes to nanotechnology, a couple things. I would advocate that everyone maybe do their own research. You need to remember that nanotechnology means that you have a particle that is exceptionally small. To put it in context, I've seen people advertise oil droplets in the 50 nanometer range. A white blood cell is 20 microns. So it's an order of magnitude larger in size. So what does that matter? That means those particles are sufficiently small. The potential exists for them to migrate essentially anywhere they want in the body. There's two pieces of a homework I always give people are, the first one is go to the FDA website and search the word nano. And you'll find that they They have very specific nanotechnology working groups. There are potential implications for people that try and develop and market products with the moniker of nanotechnology on them. They may come. The FDA reserves the right to ask additional questions that are not part of the standard purview, if you so choose to use the word nanotechnology. So go do your diligence, look on the FDA website. Classically, the FDA is not a super fan of these incredibly small particles, especially with a compound that is essentially, for all intents and purposes, nascent under the auspices of the FDA. The second component, go to your local Walgreens or CVS. These are very well seasoned companies that provide components, drugs, supplements, medicines to the pharmaceutical industry or from the pharmaceutical industry. Go do a marketing study and find out how many, cough syrups or different medicines are sold as a nanotechnology, because it sounds really cool, right? It's a marketing piece, and scientists get super excited about their ability and their technology to make these small particles. It does present the potential for regulatory issues from both the marketing, labeling, and health and safety perspective. So while it is a very cool moniker and it's very trendy, you may find yourself having to answer a bunch of different questions or to do a whole bunch of different testing that you not necessarily have counted on. Does it mean that there are no technologies on the planet that make particles that small? No. And they may have been dealt with appropriately through a regulatory body or different regulatory agencies, but people are still traditionally not marketing them as those products just because it's sort of a forbidden word, not forbidden, but it's not a happy word under the roof of the FDA buildings.
So smaller is not always better. Yeah. As on this regulatory piece, there's one additional aspect that I think is fascinating, which is the idea of organic CBD or organic cannabinoid products. Given that there are still not federal standards around organic, I'm curious. There's two aspects here. One, have you seen an uptake in brand or product manufacturers looking to make organic compounds or organic products? And then two, how do you end up with or how do you make an organic claim in an environment where you don't have the sort of kind of national regulatory structure for organic products the way you would for most other consumer products?
Yeah, the first part, yes, we've seen an uptick in people that are looking for market differentiation when, to label something as organic. I would say a preponderance of people that are doing it now are just saying organically grown hemp. There are there are multiple different ways to do extraction of the hemp plant. And then there are multiple different downstream processing that may or may not occur based on the type of cannabinoids that you're buying. All of the different extraction techniques, nor all of the subsequent downstream processing can all be labeled as organic. So it becomes a bit of a minefield to navigate when you're looking. You're going to have to make sure that, and there are some people who may be a very accomplished grower and extractor of hemp, may not have the breadth and the depth of regulatory understanding about what they can and can't say around certain products. So I did have an instance where I had a grower and extractor who did organically grow his hemp, and then he was selling it as organic hemp, but there were multiple steps in the downstream processing that precluded that material from literally being officially organic. And it was literally just because there was not a level of understanding that not only do you have to grow it organically, but the processing and the handling also needs to be organic as well. So you do have a number of different players that are starting to supply the industry that may not have the understanding that they need to, and are passing along not intentionally misleading information, but sometimes just a misunderstood situation. So yes, it is becoming a thing now. The one thing that people already have to become, and product developers that are savvy already understand that cannabinoids by themselves are probably a very expensive input for their product as a whole. In many cases, the cannabinoids might be the most expensive raw material in their formula, or one of the most expensive raw materials in the formula. We all know that organic carries with it, a fairly hefty surcharge at times. And so just assess the financial and commercial viability of a product. When consumers are now becoming accustomed to paying $5-6 a can retail for a 20 milligram CBD beverage, and now if you add on an organic claim, is that customer willing to absorb another 50 cents or $1 or whatever the upcharge is for that particular product? You may find that the consumers are now becoming savvy and they're used to looking at price point per milligram. It's already kind of an expensive buy. Are you going to get someone to fork over the extra cash for an organic? So there will always be a niche market for 100% organic products, and the organic market has its place. It's just, you're already talking about it exceptionally. We haven't seen the explosion of organic wine that everyone had predicted, just because the price point and the yields were lower, and it just hasn't, there's still a certain fraction of the consumer public who's going to want, need, and buy an organic wine, but it has not taken over the way that people are predicting it was going to. So I would envision a similar case for organic cannabinoid products. Most people, as long as you give them a whole plant extract, that's what we've been educating, or the cannabis industry as a whole has been educating consumers to look for the whole plant goodness, not necessarily look for organic whole plant goodness.
No, we agree, particularly given some of the challenges we're already seeing with excess inventory from the past couple of harvests on the hemp side. The additional cost of producing organic at a time that you're seeing such depressed wholesale pricing does make for a challenging value proposition. So it's going to be a niche market. There's always going to be a consumer looking for it. But one, make sure you understand what the claims are that you're making. And two, make sure that you've tested to make sure that there's a market sufficient to support the scale at which you intend to produce. So then maybe a final question about kind of preparing to go to market. And the Farm Bill legalized hemp nationally, and as you said, with the exception of at least legalizing infused cannabinoids in food. But as we have seen, particularly the THC markets expand so dramatically over the past 6 to 7 months. Curious about how Source expands into new markets, and how that kind of licensing process and operationalization process happens for a consumer who may be trying to enter a new market, if they're going to be working with Source to do that.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, we have a number of different mechanisms by which we can support companies as they enter the THC space, whether it's simply as a raw material supply stream, or licensed, products that have proof of market, or other avenues. And the good thing is that most of the states, when they go legal, there is sort of this waiting period for everyone, for them to dial in. Like New York is legal, except it's not yet. So you have a period of time where, like, if you decide, look, I'm going to get a license, I would like to become a THC, edible producer in this specific market. Like, who are the companies, who are the players, who can I talk to? You have some time to go, investigate different companies, see what the product offerings are, how would you maybe like go to business with different providers, because when people look at becoming like 100% vertically integrated, we see it becomes, unless you're like the biggest of the big, it becomes very hard for most companies to become 100% vertically integrated. To become proficient at growing and extraction and producers and distributors is in many times like a very laborious task. So you're looking for companies that are maybe excelling or have expertise in different areas, and Source has its place. And if you want to grow and extract and you just want someone to help convert it into a dispersible platform, then that's where we fit. But yeah, we have a lot of mechanisms. So anyone that's either his state is just coming online or they're talking about coming online, now is the time to start having discussions with different providers of, you just find there's never a right answer. There's the right answer for you.
That's great. And huge opportunity given the number of new markets that have come online or that are going to be coming online over the next couple of years. Great time to be doing that R&D. So, Michael, this has just been a profoundly illuminating conversation. We've covered a huge amount of ground. I'd like to close just in the last couple of minutes here with the look ahead. And maybe I'll begin first by asking, you travel a lot, you've worked with a lot of clients, and you clearly have a profound understanding of this market. From your perspective, what is driving consumers to embrace infused products the way they are? Why are they taking off at the rate that they are?
Yeah, it's really, and it's sort of, we sort of predicted the outcome a while ago as things became legal. Especially when you look strategically at the THC market, for instance, the people that were immensely like gravitating to the industry were probably people that were already doing it, not necessarily legally. And the preponderance of those people were traditionally using cannabis products in a traditional manner, which is smoking. And now we've invited the rest of the population who either didn't want to do something that was illegal or deemed illegal, or they don't want to be demonized as a marijuana smoker, but they're sort of curious. These kind of curious people that are starting to now flood the market, many of them are not gravitating to smoking. And whether it's, there's a stigma around smoking, or you're inhaling smoke, which we know from the cigarettes, the cigars, is potentially not the best thing to do to your lungs. Like there's becoming this huge consumer base that is gravitating away from traditional platforms. And people want to consume the product, but they don't want to be exceptionally overt in their consumption. So a mint or a gummy bear or a drink or a confectionery product is looked at as a preferred mechanism for many of the new to the space. And we also see some people that are gravitating away from smoking because they're previously, we all knew the horrible edible nightmare stories. People are like, I just can't do edibles. But now technology and companies have come along to help solve for the problems that existed in the old pot brownies. A pot brownie experience today is not what it was 10 years ago. You're seeing this entire group of people gravitate to the edible space. And to your point earlier, one of the fascinating things for me to do is to go to a market, and I always go to the same dispensary, and it might often be, 3 months intervals. And over the last 18 months, 2 years, where you used to find like one mint and maybe a couple gummies and maybe if you're lucky, a beverage. Now you see coolers full of beverages and walls full of gummies and mints and edible products. And flower isn't like it still has a huge chunk of the market, but it's now starting to lose ground to a lot of these products. So the fact that the consumer can go home and eat a gummy in the comfort of their own home and not have to worry about smoking and stinking up the joint or you can take it with you to your hotel room, or you can travel with it. Like if you're, in state, is a lot more appealing to people. And that's where we've seen the influx of new consumers. That's where the market is going. And that's just what's driving this adoption of infused products, is that people are just migrating from smoking.
To that point, one of the really clarifying experiences I had that really cemented this idea of how much of a sea change we've seen. I hadn't been to California in 12 months, and I was recently there in May. And there's a dispensary I go to that I've been going to regularly for years there, and I use it as a grounding base on how the market is evolving. And two major shifts have happened in the year that I'd been away. One is that they had moved all of their flower to the back of the store. So you now have to walk the length of the dispensary to get to the flower. But two, you start at the front of the store and it's all beverages. And then you walk through the entire middle of the store, which is every manner of infused product. And the combination of the total shelf space being taken up by these infused products, and two, the caliber of the marketing, the branding, the kind of the thoughtfulness of the products that you see reflected on these shelves, I think is another reason why people are adopting these new products. I think for the flower consumer, there's no way you're walking through that store not having something catch your eye that you might pick up in addition to the flower that you'll pick up when you get to the back of the store. And so even amongst flower consumers, our research is showing us that they're beginning to supplement. They're not substituting yet the flower, but they're beginning to supplement their use, the consumption with infused products. And I think that's a trend that's only going to accelerate, even as you have these new consumers who are coming into the market that may not be legacy consumers, but are finding a lot more product options that feel authentic to them, that are aligned with the way that they might want to consume. So, tackling some late breaking news. Last week, the leader of the Senate, Chuck Schumer, introduced a proposed bill to deschedule cannabis federally. And I think that's really stimulated a conversation around what might federal regulations mean, both for the THC market and for the fact that we don't have resolution on the CBD side around things like infused foods. What are some of the things you're looking for in terms of federal regulations that might emerge over the next, say, 12 to 36 months?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I got asked the other week, and I was almost surprised by my own answer, but the more I thought about it, I think federal legalization of marijuana will happen in a much more expeditious and consistent, uniform rate than even CBD will. And but if you think about it, like, there's no way on this planet that THC is not going to be considered a drug by the FDA. So we've passed that hurdle. Like, we know the FDA is going to look at THC as a drug. Whether or not it's a scheduled drug or not, or whether or not it's legal to take, it's going to be a drug. So that and states like Colorado and Washington and California and some of these states that have been doing this for a number of years now are becoming quite sophisticated in their regulations, their laws. Most states will coddle together something in the infancy of the program, but as they become more familiar with, like, taxation and labeling and testing and those things, they're developing much more robust systems. So the FDA now, or some agency now, has the ability to take a look at the things that all these different states do and sort of pick and pull from, like, Colorado does this really, really well. We're going to emulate that in our country. California does this really, really well. Like, how do you control access to the products? And, we've gone from having to have a medical marijuana card and going to a dispensary, and now you can dial a dispensary and have it delivered to your hotel room in California. So there are a lot of mechanisms in place and different, so that these guys can draw from. Cannabinoid space is still like, and no one is worried about, most people that consume cannabis, like, they aren't talking about it curing anything. They're just taking that. They may be taking it for a medicinal reason, but that most people are doing it for medicinal purposes and for recreational purposes. the CBD industry is already talking about, well, it does this and it affects that, and there isn't a preponderance of data out there to say yay or nay. It really does work. They still don't know. Like, no one, I don't think anyone is really going to be worried about the terpene content or the CBG or the CBN content of marijuana. Whereas the CBD, as we're selling to that, they are going to pay attention to it. So I wouldn't be shocked if federal legalization happens even at the same time, if not before, the whole CBD mess gets figured out. I wouldn't be shocked by it at all.
Something that, particularly we're Washington-based or DC-based organizations, something we're going to be keeping a very close eye on over the next little while. So then maybe, Michael, one big picture final question for you. You're really at the cutting edge of this really dynamic ecosystem. What are some of the big innovations you're looking out for in this market?
Yeah, I think when we look for innovation inside the cannabis market, like, I really think that we're going to go, one of the big drivers is going to be targeted therapeutics, you know. And we already see there's some products in the market, others are starting to come along, but, like, you know, chronic can't sleep. Well, we know that people are doing designer systems, combinations of CBD, high on CBN, you know, other nootropics, adaptogens, these things that are literally specifically targeted for, like, a therapeutic benefit, whether it's sleep or restlessness or anxiety or all those things. I think you're going to see boutique and designer systems. We're already starting to see them. And I think the floodgates are just starting to open, where we see, like, a preponderance of you walk in, and instead of buying a CBD gummy, you're going to buy your nighttime gummy, your morning gummy, your gym gummy, your whatever. And then the other thing that I think is people are starting to become in tune to is this, like, other compounds that we traditionally, like other things that weightlifters and body lifters and athletes are all into, you know, pre-workout, post-workout beverages that may contain, like, creatine or amino acids, you know, high protein concentrations. Like, what combination of cannabinoids could assist or be complementary to a lot of those conditions? So again, it's like this targeted therapeutic. And then I think delivery systems, like, that's really going to come to play. And you see that again and again in the pharmacy aisle when you talk about, like, rapid release of a pain medicine or extended release of a pain medicine. Not a lot of the cannabis companies are making specifically tuned systems for, maybe we have a combination product, which is an immediate release, high CBN, to help you fall asleep. And then you've extended release, you know, could be chamomile, melatonin, CBN, CBD as an extended release to help you stay asleep. So those are the things, I think, between the therapeutic avenues and new and novel delivery systems. That's really, I think, where we're going to see the next genesis.
I'm so glad you said that, because one of the things that we've been cautioning innovators in this space is to recognize that you should be planning for where the market is going, not where it currently is. You know, in these early stages of the legal regulated cannabinoid economy, there's a lot of companies that came out with the goal of being all things to all men and women. And as we began to see this fragmentation happen, and it is going from fragmentation to hyperfragmentation, really important to figure out what product you're building, who that product is aimed for, and what its intended use. Be careful about making the claims, but have clear lines of sight about a specific audience with a specific use case. Because as this market matures, consumers, to Michael's point, are going to be looking for products that do specific things rather than the one size fits all. And so having that foresight, even as the market evolves to that, I think will be a strong source of competitive advantage in an increasingly crowded and increasingly competitive ecosystem. Well, with that, what a conversation. I can't imagine that there are many things that we have not addressed during this conversation, but if there are questions that you had for Michael that we didn't get to, you can still put them into your Q&A input in your audience interface. We will get those questions, we will answer them, we'll get them back to you. But thank you to everyone who submitted questions. This has been a phenomenal conversation. Just a reminder, go to newfrontierdata.com/reports to gain access to 2 of the reports that we co-produced with Source, exploring the infused product landscape based on who the customers are, what they're buying and why they're buying what they buy. And then 2, talking about some of the regulatory and implementational considerations as you're building a product for this market. You know, on a personal note, and on behalf of our team, I really want to thank Michael and the rest of the Source team for just being such extraordinary partners through this process. The caliber of insights I think we've been able to collaboratively produce have been phenomenal. And this webinar, this webcast, I think is just case exemplar of that. Michael, I have tried to stump you. I keep failing, but I'm going to continue to try. Thank you for being just such a font of insight, of knowledge, and a guide for the stakeholders who are going to be trying to navigate this increasingly dynamic, phenomenally exciting, but extremely complicated and complex market. My name is John Kagia. I'm the Chief Knowledge Officer at New Frontier Data, and it's been an absolute pleasure to be a moderator for this conversation. Michael, you are a rock star, and as always, thank you.
Thank you.
So with that, you will be receiving a copy of this webcast in your inbox, but please keep those questions coming. And continue to take advantage of all of the resources that we've been able to co-produce with Source. Really valuable and critical insights as you navigate the infused product landscape. From the team at New Frontier Data, which is with gratitude that we thank Source for sponsoring this webinar, and it has been a pleasure to have this conversation. Thank you very much.